Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our regular Thursday stream. We are managing to keep up with these generally, I would say. Let me double check and make sure. No, okay. I'm just making sure people aren't getting like unskippable ads and horrendous stuff like that. But they're not doing, so
I
that's
did I
good.
did remember to do that bit in the settings.
Yeah, sometimes it resets it. YouTube is a right bastard for serving ads wrong for its own benefit, but that's by the by.
Also, hello
Um,
people.
Yes, I was gonna say, um, we have Evelyn here. We have, of course, me here because this is my YouTube channel. Um, despite Evelyn being, yes, yeah, Evelyn specifically said we need to go live before people say late, and we managed to beat you there, Grillin. So, ha, we beat the late sayers. But yeah, despite Evelyn doing her telethon and stuff, this is still my YouTube channel, guys. Please believe me. There's no Trig today, unfortunately. He's got quite a bad fever. And he's getting that checked out. So hopefully he gets better. Um, yeah, I don't understand how you can be part of the distant right when you start on time.
See, that's the
We've
real
been found
question.
out. Yeah. We've been
No, we will need to
we've been
have a
found
discussion
out.
about how the fact that this is our channel, comrade.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Anyway, shall we move on to the subject of the stream? Because
I
there's
will
been
say
a.
possibly one thing first that we should
Oh,
thank the
okay.
usual membery people who throw us a little bit of money every month, along with people who donate and whatever else, and those who just generally turn up to the streams and share them around because
Yes.
it constantly gives us a reason to keep doing them and putting more work into them, and hopefully I don't know. I'm still trying to get to grips with it all, but I think I've got to a point where, if I've got a good idea and I know a good guest, I can generally arrange stuff. So hopefully there should be more kind of streams with, different sort of guests or slightly deeper topics or whatever else. Just more
Um.
for the sake of trying to improve myself, really.
Yes. I've not done it for a while, but I need to actually thank the people who have been members. So, thank you to GC Mitt, you've been a member for 4 months. Thank you, Windtalk. You've been a member for 13 months. Wow, there's quite a few people who've been a member quite a long time. Kale of the Bluefy, 11-month member. S. Smith, 12 months. James Merry, one of our chat mods there, 12 months. Portrait Seal, 12 months. HK9410, my favorite firearm, 12 months. Uh, Sock Addict, I can never say that right. 13 months, and Tank Imperator for 13 months. So thank you very much for that, guys. We are still fully monetized. Just get the normal YouTubey stuff out of the way. So that is the best way to support us on a recurring basis. We don't really have enough critical mass on like Subscribestar, and the way that takes the least cut, as I keep telling people, is Streamlabs. That goes
Alright, I've
directly
got it.
into PayPal, and that generally gets the less cut taken out of it. So if you guys want to donate and have questions read out and stuff, Streamlabs is the best way to do that. But aside from that, really, we mostly do this for the love of content. It is good to get a few shekels, and interaction does help. As everyone always points out to a cringe degree, but interaction does help streams. It does help, even if it's not being served to outside people. It at least helps it show up on people's feeds who are subscribed. Because YouTube's a right bastard. If a stream or a video gets no interaction, it just hides it from
Well,
everyone.
yeah, that's
Um,
something I've tried to explain to loads and loads of people, the way that like serving algorithms work, whereby your content is normally served to say 10% of your
yeah.
audience, and whatever of that 10% actually clicks and engages with it is then reflected in the other 90 percentage who then get served, that content, that kind of ratio comes across. I think is why it's so important as well. Like I always notice if our streams pick up at the start, like this one seems to be doing a little, so we'll make sure we get moving soon. They always tend to carry on quite well. It's more if it
Yes.
hits a mid kind of lull, it doesn't tend to grow fully. But anyway, enough metrics. I suppose we should, as you said,
We should actually get into.
there was a few people
Yeah.
who I don't think didn't quite grasp really the topic. I think that we're going for here.
It is a bit of an inside baseball reference if you haven't, if few things don't
Hmm.
click. We're talking, well, it's one of our infinite series since everything seems to be the Infinite X on this channel.
It's a good,
After
it's a good sort of moniker though. I think it works. It's a
it
brand.
is, it's very endless trash, but it's endless politics. Yeah, it's stemming, of course, from the classic stream, The Infinite Crab Bucket. If you've never seen that, it's a relatively timeless one, and it is me and Trig leaning into a gimmick far too hard, but it's just funny, mostly because of the crab and bucket jokes,
Hmm.
uh, and Fishenberg. But yeah, those of you who remember the Deep Lore remember that. But what we're really talking about here is sovereign is he who makes the exception.
We'll get to
We're
that bit
getting
in a moment. Well, no, I think we've kind of used some of Carl Schmitt's work in the democratization series, and he's a very interesting thinker and one that I would recommend everyone goes and read, even if you read it once and it all kind of comes across as legalese and very kind of highfalutin. The points that he's actually trying to make are very simple, so that once you kind of read it and then you start to see it in other things, all of a sudden it starts to click. And as you say, the moniker, the sovereign is he who makes the exception, or his idea of the friend enemy distinction become these sort of, the Swiss Army knife of like political disarmament tools. They're fantastic. This is how you can understand so many situations.
Well, the concept we're talking about is I guess, relatively familiar concept of some of the other title for this stream was going to be the Infinite Crisis, but that's a really cringe Marvel reference now. So I didn't want to use
Yeah.
that in case people thought
I
we were
will
talking about
quickly as
Marvel
well
comics.
post in the chat a link for the PDF of this if anyone wants to read it, because I know unless you want to buy all the Schmidt works together, sometimes it's a bit of a pain in the arse. But what's funny in something like this is this is some academic reprint of him from the 80s by George Swab and Tracy B. Strong. Gonna let that lie there. But obviously, if you know who Schmidt was and you know the people he was a part of working with during German legal theory and works during the 30s and 40s, he did some very interesting things. However, his sort of his politics is so concise and it's so down to a point that the established can't avoid using it. And I think it's very much this
Yes.
is something Auron and A talked about in their stream the other week. That it's Hume and Althusser, maybe not Althusser, but like these it's liberals and general leftists that you read in your undergrad university. But if you actually go and you go right up the tree and you go to the think tanks, they will be looking at stuff like Schmitt from either a leftist or a liberal or a pragmatic perspective. So what that means is you get these reprints where there is like 30 pages of apologia and contextualizing. Yeah,
Reframing, yeah.
so that they can
This
just reuse them and make sure that they're not losing that part of a tradition of thought they would
it's
they would otherwise hate, mind you.
it's like a 40-page version of we're just quoting rap lyrics.
Mm. No, it's very that. But no, it's because I just find this bit really funny. Schmidt was perhaps the leading jurist during the Weimar Republic. In May 1933, he joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, in brackets. The same month as did Martin Heidegger, the leading philosopher in Germany. In November of that year,
Socialist Workers' Party, you say?
he
Sorry.
became part of the National Socialists Jurists Association. He published several works that were supportive of the Nazi Party, including some that were anti-Semitic. And then there's a thing that goes on here to say that I think they're trying to again apologize for it or something there. But it's this line here I just find hilarious. All did not go smoothly. One tends to forget that there were diverse factions in Nazism.
The first Nazis. This is gonna start getting very pink swastika very fast if they go down the wrong alley.
Yeah. Anyway, well, we shall get to the meat and the bones here, or at least a couple of pages of this, and we'll leave the rest of the text for other people to read because one's very interesting. Once it loads, at least. But no, Schmidt, very much like Robert Filmer before him, draws heavily on the idea of or it was Jean Baudon's idea of sovereignty, I should say, which is this very absolutist notion of it, which we'll come across in a second as we get into it. I think it was someone there saying in chat, how come Spengler doesn't get that kind of cover? Because Spengler's not useful to the powers that be, really, and outside of maybe some of his stuff on media analysis, which, again, they would use that in a way where they're contextualizing it as bad, but be underhandedly taking notes about, that's interesting. Yeah, we'll do that.
I'd say a lot of Spengler as well has essentially been rewritten from the other direction by large parts of the left.
Well, yeah. A lot of your Theodor Adorno, your Frankfurt schools maybe weren't
It's
explicitly written that way, but were in a lot of ways responses to the reactionary writers at that, like at Spengler's
yeah, they
kind of
don't
time.
read Spengler because they read Marcuse. Is the answer?
Anyway, we shall get into it. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. Only this definition can do justice to a borderline concept. Contrary to the imprecise terminology that is found in popular literature, a borderline concept is not a vague concept, but one pertaining to the outermost sphere. This definition of sovereignty must therefore be associated with a borderline case, and not with routine. It will soon become clear that the exception is to be understood to refer to a general conception in the theory of the state, and not merely a construct applied to any emergency decree or state of siege. The assertion that the exception is truly appropriate for the juristic definition of sovereignty has a systematic, legal logical foundation. The decision on the exception is a decision in the true sense of the word, because a general norm, as represented by an ordinary legal prescription, can never encompass a total exception. The decision that a real exception exists cannot therefore be entirely derived from this norm. When Robert von Moll said that the test of whether an emergency exists cannot be a juristic one, he assumed that a decision in the legal sense must be derived entirely from the content of a norm. But this is the question. In the general sense in which Moll articulated his argument, his notion is only an expression of constitutional liberalism and fails to apprehend the independent meaning of the decision. Very sort of high level conceptual language to, in a certain sense, just say that if you're engaging with something that isn't procedure but still becomes ratified as law, you are the sovereign entity because no other entity has the ability to do that in that moment. He's talking about
Yeah, it's
it's so kind of real world that you actually need to like think for a second about like
well,
what he's
he's
trying to
in
say.
simple terms, he's talking about two things. One, he's talking about who gets to decide what is and isn't normal procedure, what isn't a prescribed action.
Mm,
And two, what he's saying is the reaction to that, reaction to these corner cases, these things that by its own definition through circular logic are defined as exceptions by the power structure. The reaction to them is decided by them.
mm,
So they have circular power. They have the power to declare what is an exception, and they have the power to react to the exception that is seen as outside the norm. And when you look at all of these cases that we're going to get to, when you look at the war on terror, when you look at before that the Cold War, when you look at the coronavirus pandemic, you look at the Ukraine stuff, you look at all of this stuff, you look at the infinite crises, the perpetual states
mm.
of quasi-emergency we go through in the supposed neutral Western democracies. What falls outside of that, the unthinkable, in these unprecedented times,
Mm, of course.
he who gets to decide what is unprecedented and then gets to decide what to do about it is by definition the holder of power and the sovereign. That's really what Schmitt in technical legalese is saying here.
mm.
They both get to declare what is a norm and what isn't, and by saying that they get to decide what is
Well,
done about it.
it's
Because
also in a
we
way explains a lot of, and maybe this is something we can discuss as we look at some of these examples. It explains why sometimes the decisions don't make sense because making the decision in the first place was the goal, not making the right decision. Because to make the right
yes.
decision wouldn't be one.
No, it's the decision making in of itself. It's when people talk about the debate around, it's something that's so played out, the LGBT stuff. Just having the debate, just making the decisions continuously and wrapping people up in those decisions is the point.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter. None of it matters. It doesn't make any sense because it's not meant to make any sense.
Mm.
Because it doesn't matter.
Well, I might grab this last part here before we get into other
Go
stuff.
ahead.
It is precisely the exception that makes relevant the subject of sovereignty, that is, the whole question of sovereignty. The precise details of an emergency cannot be anticipated, nor can one spell out what may take place in such a case, especially when it is true of a matter of extreme emergency and of how it is to be eliminated. The precondition, as well as the content of jurisdictional competence in such a case, must necessarily be unlimited. From the liberal constitutional point of view, there would be no jurisdictional competence at all. The most guidance the Constitution can provide is to indicate who can act in such a case. If such action is
Yes.
not subject to controls, if it is not hampered in some way by checks and balances, as in the case in a liberal constitution, then it is clear who the sovereign is. He decides whether there is an extreme emergency, as well as what must be done to eliminate it. Although he stands outside the normally valid legal system, he nevertheless belongs to it, for it is he who must decide whether the Constitution needs to be suspended in its entirety. All tendencies in modern constitutional development point toward eliminating the sovereign in this sense. The ideas of Hugo Crabbe and Hans Kelsen, which will be treated in the following chapter, are in line with this development. But whether this extreme exception can be banished from the world is not a juristic question. Whether one has confidence and hope that it can be eliminated depends on philosophical, especially on philosophical, historical, or metaphysical convictions. See, that is an interesting point that you said there, because when I first read that and I looked through and thought all tendencies of modern constitutional development point towards eliminating the sovereign in this sense, I think, yeah, of course they do. They hate sovereignty. Actually, they don't.
No.
So,
It's an unreachable goal.
hmm,
You can't have law that covers everything.
no,
It's like a knowledge and calculation
no, no.
problem, but in a
Of
legal
course you can't.
sense.
I suppose that's what he's talking about here. Is that that maybe that I should focus more on the word tendency there. Then he's talking about the nature of a liberal constitutional law and its want to become a total
Yeah, it's
system of
stated
law.
goals.
Ah, yeah.
Yes. But what you end up really is you end up with ever more legal, just law in the abstract in this process. You have this double process where you constantly get these exceptions. These exceptions lead to ever more convoluted law, which leads to ever more convoluted exceptions, which leads to ever more convoluted. It's like how we ended up with like the coronavirus legislation,
Mm-hmm.
because it's why clown world gets more clowny, if you will. It's why these emergencies get more silly, and it's why eventually it's going to be aliens.
Yeah, basically.
This process actually explains uh actually explains the blue beam pill, because once you've got law that covers things
This
like
is
niche
this
pandemics.
is something that Schmitt ends up making a point about at some point. Uh, where it basically says that, well, if you've you can't get rid of politics, because if you were to fight every enemy on Earth in the friend enemy distinction, then you would have to have some existential or extraterrestrial enemy through which you can get the people to
Yes,
interact in a political fashion. To what's this here? James Storer in chat. Harry and Gladive called Evelyn a Luddite and
it's
a
it's
leftist. Lol.
no, hey, no one likes a snitch, okay? Um, yeah, I'm sure the 15 people watching got a chuckle out of it. Um,
True.
Anyway, what was I saying? Yes, it's why eventually, it's why these emergencies ramp up and the things get sillier and sillier. Because we have law now that covers the minutia of, eh, what isn't technically considered a handgun. You can have a counterweight, and like firearms legislation is something quite topical, and it's a good example of it. It's how you get wrapped up in these ridiculous legal definitions of, you can have a 16-inch rifle in the US, but you can't have a 15-inch barrel that becomes a
Hmm.
short-barreled rifle. And it's about trying to plug all these gaps, because you can't legislate everything. The
They
Constitution
don't
can't
want
cover everything.
the water of sovereignty to sink into their ship.
No, but it's a false, it's a false aim. It's a false goal. It's an impossible goal. You can never legislate away the role of the sovereign. You can't legislate away decision making. And when decision making must take place, the sovereign rears his head. And that is never more obvious than in these perpetual states of emergency. It's like, well, we have this functioning constitution. America, in the wake of the Vietnam War, the people thought that America would never get themselves entangled in another pointless foreign war for nebulous political goals. And then you have this traumatic event in 9/11 that essentially short circuits the collective consciousness of the nation to a point that they're willing to accept basically two Vietnams in a row, because they have created such a powerful exception and such sovereignty is wielded that the promises that they were made, the never agains, if you will, of American foreign policy, were able to be completely swept away by sovereign power.
Pretty much.
Although I don't know, there's so many good examples of this. It interfaces quite well. I don't want to read it yet because we have quite a few things to go through. But there's a good quote I want to get into slightly further on in the stream by Robert Higgs, because this interfaces very well with the idea of the ratchet, with what he's talked about in Crisis and Leviathan. This is the hand. It's not the hand that rocks the cradle; it's the hand that pulls the ratchet. The exception, the process of the exception, and the invisible hand, of the sovereign is what pulls the ratchet. That the sovereignty is being able to pull the ratchet. It is one of the great functions of government, that they are able to do that, and they're able to do that through these exceptions, because we're supposed to have this neutral system that is almost naive in some ways. It's like when they talk about, oh, we never thought this could happen, so we're going to have to make it up as we go along. When they had all these plans and these scenarios and these biological war games they were doing, it's like, of course they knew this was going to happen. They've been salivating over it, and they've had all these things waiting in the wings. But there's also this false naivety of government when these unprecedented emergencies hit them. They act like these poor public servants, as deers caught in the headlights of, oh well, we're just trying to do our best to react to this, and we're not perfect. All the hand wringing comes out.
Mea culpa.
Very much so.
Sorry, headphone users. I shall try to stop clearing my throat.
You're so croaky today. Why are you so croaky? Yeah, these were all the one things we didn't want to happen.
Oh no! What are the odds?
I'm humanical foreigner. Oh, that's a Brass Eye reference, I believe. When they try and launch a pedophile into orbit, but accidentally leave an 8-year-old boy in the capsule with him.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good special.
Is this an independent premium article? Ooh, oh bugger! I should have got an archive link for that. I'm so stupid.
Why are you so stupid?
Because I steal them
this?
off Apple News and my phone, and that lets me look at them.
Yeah, I'm afraid this isn't going to work. Let me see if I can grab you an archive quickly. But yeah, I have an extension that shows me. I think it's called Archive Everywhere. Here, I have an archive version. I've rescued you. It is in this chat. There we go. Now I use archive dot whatever it's using. It's currently archive.ph. But the Internet Archive project is amazing. It's the one thing I would actually donate money to if I donated money to things, but I don't. So
anyway,
Anyway.
Wait, so this alright, 16. Sorry, confusing myself there. No, this is something that I just had come across my feed on Monday when I was reading through stuff. But it's kind of got like some. It's one of those ones. It's like it's interesting what they do mention, and it's more interesting what they don't mention. The usual sort of sly stuff like that. The fact that they're starting out with something along the lines of, it's been a long time since concern around COVID-19 dominated the headlines. It's not really been that long. I mean, I think we were still getting stuff in the headlines. Like recommended pandemic science hub will develop drugs for lung infections. There we go. There's a news story right there. The first advert, and they're still talking about it. Anyway, we're still talking about people getting their fourth and fifth boosters and all this kind of nonsense. It just feels so like gaslighting, especially when you start to think about the fact that like when I tried to look up about how had the sunset clause for the laws been enacted yet or anything like that, and it's like no information.
Yes, it's again, it's interesting how it follows the same trajectory though as the terrorism, the war on terror lot has,
Hmm.
because we've we've never seen the end of that. That's gone out of public consciousness to such a high degree. We just assume it's all over, but it isn't.
Because
All those laws are still in the books, and it's very much aimed now at the right-wing extremism narrative.
hmm.
Um,
Well, that's
we really are the people that all of this was meant for.
I suppose we'll get to tying all these things together at some point. I just think there's some like this the way that this article functions as like a public relations measure, so that oh well, it's okay because the media is saying that COVID's over because Partygate means we shouldn't believe the government, but the media exposed the government over Partygate, so we should trust the media. So when the media says it's over and the government says it's over, then yeah, it's good. Especially when they slip in things like UK's vaccination wall has been built high and strong, not by their own metrics, because most people that have taken a jab have only taken one shot. I think there is something like at least a good nearly 20 million people in Britain who haven't taken anything, and then there's another 15 million or so that have just taken one shot. So there's roughly almost half the population
Well,
that's taken one or no
over
jabs, so
Christmas,
isn't
I
fully
say
jabbed. So
over
it's
I can say over Christmas they redefined the
mm,
definition of fully vaccinated to three.
mm.
You couldn't get a vaccine passport to go into a nightclub if you were one of the first waves of people who've had your double vax. By their own definition, if you're 6 months out from any kind of needle prick, you are unvaccinated.
Well,
So again, the
it's always plaguing my mind at the moment. You need to be 2 weeks out from a vaccine to get into America. 2 weeks.
yep.
That's insane. That's them basically making it like the exception is now that not only do you take your shoes off before you get in the plane, you take this jab too. It's like every holiday you're going to the bloody Congo. Ah.
We'll see about that one, James Mary. That's all I'll say on that matter. But yes, it very much reminds me of the chat that we had about World War II and the end of World War II, in that different countries declared the beginning of this pandemic, but it seems
Mm.
that there has been this unified front in everywhere apart from China, that the Western world, the WHO, all of these people have now declared that the pandemic it's not over, but it's moved into like the settled phase. It's moved into the background noise phase where they can wheel it out again as a piece of the political furniture, like the war, the war on drugs, the war on terror, all of this stuff, the climate change.
Arriving at where we are today has not been without pain and suffering. More than 175,000 lives have been lost. Well, if you want to be a real Hegelian about it, how many human lives have been lost in the last 40,000 years for us all just to get here, chappy? Huh? What means this story has anything to do with your minor Hegelian historical narrative about these lives that may or may have not been lost, building up? We wouldn't be here without them.
It's
uh,
ah, it's funny that we get this again. We get this like sunk cost fallacy of lives.
mm.
As we've sacrificed so much already. It's
All those people
as
couldn't
we
have
spoke.
died for nothing.
Yes,
uh,
it basically it's just like even if we were lying to you, all these people died. So are you going to disrespect their memory just because you found out the truth? It's it's this great piece of like of constant emotional manipulation. Who are these people though? Like this is the question I
mm.
pose to everyone who expresses doubt about this, or even just expresses indignation at doubt being expressed. It's like who are all these supposed victims? Like, where are the empty families? Where are the crying relatives? Where are all these people?
Hmm.
Because I don't know fucking anybody
Well,
who's
it's
had, like, apart from like 90-year-old auntie so and so,
well,
who had food withdrawn from them in a nursing home.
not to
Um,
not to beat the horse that everyone else doesn't want to, or not everyone else, but a lot of people don't want to engage with. I know more people who have, or I know more and know of more people that have had bad effects from the jab than I know of people who even had a severe case of COVID, never mind died.
yeah, yeah,
So,
but again, as I keep telling people, making a medical argument, not to invalidate what we've just said, is kind of useless because it's not a medical issue, it's a sovereign issue.
hmm.
It's an issue of the declaration of emergency and the withdrawal of it for the declaration of the new emergency. The narrative at the fever pitch that it's been is no longer useful. So it's being, as I was saying, that they're doing a declaration of victory
Well,
in a
it's,
sense that the Allies did at the end of World
yeah,
War Two.
there's an interesting thing we could maybe look at there as we get through more of these, as well as, you know, it is the legal exception is still valid, but the narrative exception they're trying to sap the energy out of it to direct us towards other things. Whereas there are other situations where a legal exception may or may not exist in some case, but the narrative exception or the painting of the sort of the political enemy, which that's the sort of inverse point that Yockey points to from Schmitt, because the when he's writing in about politics and Imperium, he has to be quoting from Schmitt. Some of it's almost word for word, but sovereignty is he who decides the exception, which means you are the political entity that gets to declare what the inner enemy is, and that there's the both elements there. There's the legal and juristic function of writing new law, and then there's actually setting the tone in regards to public perception. Are you still there?
Oh, sorry, I'm still here. I just had my headphones muted. Sorry about that.
Ah.
I was having a bit of a big sneeze. I'm better now. It's okay. I don't want to sneeze all over the audience. But no, you're right. They get to declare who the inner and outer enemy is. They get to declare who is and isn't the subject of whatever state of emergency, whatever state of exception there is. And in doing so, I guess that's like the third leg of their power, in that they decide what is the exception, they decide the reaction to the exception, they decide who the exception applies to.
Well, see,
Especially all right when it comes to the friend enemy distinction stuff.
it's also kind of funny as well that this article follows the kind of rule of journalism, where if you're answering a question in the title, the answer is always no. Is the COVID pandemic over? Well, how much further the virus can evolve remains contested, and it's not clear what characteristics the next variant will possess. If it acquires new mutations which allow it to circumvent the vaccines and those parts of the immune system responsible for preventing an escalation in severe disease, then there could be trouble. So it's a no then. The
It's
pandemic
it
isn't over. It's ready to start back up at any moment.
it's very we don't know where the next terror cell is.
Hmm. But
It's
forget how long
very
this article. There's just, again, this is one of those ones where there's just so much stuff in here that's basically just like gaslighting, and then they start talking about HIV and T cell stuff and try to explain away or not mention the fact that people that were taking a vaccine were having their T cell counts show up as within the same zone as people with HIV. But was
yep.
that something we don't talk about now?
No, and that's something that will get you yeeted. It's one of the few things that's still like the big medical no-no. They've conceded on many grounds. They've loosened a lot of that stuff because you only have to propagandize at the precise moment it's relevant, and then they don't really care.
Hmm.
Um, that's what I keep trying to tell people who believe a lot of, like the flat Earth people. Basically, it's like no, they like when they carry out these injustices against you, when they essentially alter reality within a moment, they always tell you afterwards to like humiliate you about it.
Hmm.
Because all this, you'll see all these articles that come out. That's why I keep telling people that making a medical argument is useless. Because they basically come out months later and say, "Oh yeah, by the way, you were right, but yeah, fuck you." Like we can tell you you were right, and we can still laugh in your faces
Hmm.
because we are in power and you are not.
Well, because
Um,
even in this
so
section here, they're actually talking at length about people's immunity decaying. Why would people's immunity be decaying? Like, oh, COVID did it. Well, COVID's just so dangerous. It's not the vaccine itself.
Um, Nennius in the chat. Actually, that's a good question I want to tackle there. So, did the establishment not care about side effects? I guess you mean for themselves. Big uptake of it
Do you
among
think
the
they're
elite.
taking
It's
it?
like, yeah. Do you think that these people who are getting injected on live TV are actually taking it? It's
Oh God.
it's do you
Are
do
we?
you really think that they're genuinely having it?
We've got weird like. I hope that's not weird Dawn drama related comments in the chat about Iron Duke's secret closet. I do not
I
care,
have
and
no
I do
idea.
not want to be involved.
I don't know what's going on there.
Please take that somewhere else.
I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, there you go.
Um,
They're talking here about the impact on the NHS and the fact that the NHS is falling a bit. It's blah 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 blah. In light of this ongoing disruption, it's hard to conclude that can't speak all of a sudden, that the epidemic has run its course, especially for those working in the NHS. Overburdened and overworked staff, many who have been pushed beyond the point of burnout, continue to grapple with the fallout from COVID on a daily basis, even if wards are no longer full of patients dying from the virus. I mean, do you remember months and months ago when we had a discussion something along the lines of think of the nurses, and that was how it was going to be remembered. Here we are.
so I'm just sat here trying not to laugh because there's another great comment in the chat that's just, "Do you think that's air you're breathing?"
Yeah,
Sorry. Uh, I've been chuckling. Um, oh God, I don't know. It's very ANAB.
yeah. Now someone's saying like the
Um,
NHS staff will be first against the wall when the revolution comes. No, actually, because they're such drones that you need them. I mean, this is the whole thing about the one interesting part about some of the stuff about the Holocaust is the public health component that was led up to it. But again,
oh yeah,
a discussion for another evening.
it is. It is. Also, I would say that large parts of the NHS basically function as slave labor.
Hmm.
Um, whether we could get into that
There's
another time as well, because
Plasma Robin chat saying playing catch up, but I must note that decision making ties not just to the sovereignty but also free will itself. Well, that's where you're getting into Filmer's idea of sovereignty, because he takes the
yeah.
concept from Jean Baudin and says it's sovereignty is you exercising your will in the abstract, not abstract, sorry, in the most arbitrary form, which is ultimately
I
him
like your
saying that just make an exception, do as you please.
yeah. I just like your characterization of Filmer, of him like turning to like Hobbes and Locke and going, "When was the state of nature, nigga? When was it? When was the state of nature? Can you?" It's,
Uh,
uh, uh, yeah, it's just no, it's a very amusing notion, but it is a very good thing to point out. But we're getting into the weeds there. I'm sorry. Just like he's cutting a wrestling promo.
yeah. I'll show you a
Like,
state of nature
yeah,
Thursday night, 9 o'clock in the ring.
it's a steel cage match. You better be ready, Hobbs. I'll show you the state of nature.
uh,
You want a war of all against all? I'll give you a war. Sorry.
yeah, he's like doing a WrestleMania promo. Cut a promo real quick.
uh, Sovereign is he you can drop from the top rope.
Yeah,
Oh dear. Hey, this is AA's influence just
he's,
pouring
he's
over.
got
This
his.
the wrestling.
Well,
The
no, because
wrestling
that
is
that
spreading.
Geo guy that was on Cigar Stream last night, he's also like a massive wrestling nerd as well.
It's everywhere. The Myers boys are into it as well. I just get it via osmosis. Uh, uh, dear.
Right. I mean, I'm just wondering because some of the other things we've got here, like one of them is just a very boring, like it is the coronavirus bill, and I got it up just for the sake of. I mean, I know it's not like people aren't going to believe us, but 73 pages, all for one law that has provisions and procedures and regulations and extensions and new exercises of previous acts, and you know it's 73 pages worth of stuff that is being added to the procedures we would otherwise do things for the state of the exception of coronavirus.
Yes. And there's also large parts of it that have been codified in just, quote unquote normal law.
Hmm.
But you had this essentially enacted as the Coronavirus Act mostly was what they refer to as secondary legislation.
Hmm.
I know this is a very boring point to make, but what happened is that the House of Commons gave the government permission for this state of exception, and they made the laws up afterwards, and they kept adding to it. And all they got to do was every 6 months they got to say yay or nay to them being able
Hmm.
to essentially rule by decree and have this quasi state of emergency without even a state of
Well, they
emergency
did
being invoked.
it. Clause
Because
76, paragraph 523. The bill provisions should apply when they are needed. Therefore, subsections 1 and 2 enable ministers to extend or terminate a particular provision through regulations. Subsection 3
yes,
stipulates that an extension may not be for more than 6 months time. To provide flexibility, these regulations can be made for blah blah. And then, yeah,
and
it's basically just an open admittance that, the sunset sort of clause for this law doesn't matter if MPs don't like continually vote for an extension, and furthermore, power to make consequential modifications, which means much like something like the Public Health Bill in 1984, which was used to, as a springboard to justify a lot of this law. This now exists on the books and can be edited in future to justify a whole other set of exceptional laws. And
well,
as you're saying, there's that ratcheting effect where there's each of these different exceptional bills required that just pile and pile and pile on until you get this sort of total system of law.
well, it very much interfaces with how the Patriot Act would work, in that the Patriot Act was promised to be this exceptional piece of legislation that only had its provisions invoked in ways that would help them specifically hunt terrorists, and you end up with it being used in secret courts to gather the phone records of every American.
Mm.
The Coronavirus Act has so many provisions in it, and there's so much of it that works permanently and doesn't fully sunset, that we may have legislation later in a completely unrelated field, in a completely related field of law that springboards off its provisions, because once you declare this quasi state of emergency. And as we've talked about it previously, but the Coronavirus Act was brought in and they didn't invoke a normal state of emergency because normal states of emergency have higher like levels of constitutional checks and balances than this does. They sidestepped like the Wartime Powers Act stuff because it was too restrictive. They had their hands tied too much, and there was actually too much oversight and too many chances to challenge it. That's why stuff like this, the exception, is so insidious, because they have legislation to deal with this already. They have these, essentially war powers acts, and the reason these aren't brought in is, one, because optically it's worse. It's a very, very naked display of power. But two, it allows them essentially to get round of the safeguards that are, very showily built into these emergency powers acts, so people can think that they are safe from essentially having the what is the quote, that a democracy might come down with a bad case of dictatorship, like someone might come down with a case of appendicitis.
Yeah.
That was quite famously said to FDR, which is great, when they about his New Deal stuff and him packing the Supreme Court. That really, it's only, democracy is only a single sneeze away from tyranny, because they just can say so.
Well, yeah,
They can
because
say, right, we're not doing this anymore.
that we have made the MPs sovereign. But I think that we
Yeah.
can. I might, before we got on to the next stuff, flick it back onto the thumbnail, because I think it's maybe a point worth discussing. But the very nature of the fact that by voting you are engaging with procedure, therefore you are not engaging in an exceptional form and are exercising no sovereignty.
No,
you're not exercising sovereignty over. I don't even know really how to frame it. You're not exercising sovereignty over the dog by picking up its shit but by walking it, you are. And this maybe
No,
just a
it's
stupid way to look at it,
you.
but you're not
The
directing
the
anything.
people
You're
the
not.
people don't ask the question; they answer it.
Mm,
Is the real
yes,
point
that's true.
here? That they don't set the limits of what is being voted on; they just vote.
Mm,
They do not decide on the process; they only partake in it. And by the very nature of the process, unless there is, a an overcorrection, as some people would say it, there is no control over what the process is, because a good citizen merely partakes in it,
mm.
and to try and change the process is to be a revolutionary and an enemy of democracy, because all you do is you partake in the process, and the process itself is sacred, and the process itself will save you. And within its own internal logic, the process itself is sovereign.
Oh yeah,
That's how it's supposed to
this is
work.
Mosca's idea of the political formula. I mean, maybe it's more as opposed to an abstract or a manifestation, something a document or a rhetoric. It's the manifestation in the very process of voting. It's just something again we've discussed time and again. But just as I've been looking at some of Moscow's stuff and thinking about the political formula, it's another very good version of it. The fact that people functionally go out and vote to them is it legitimizes it, despite the fact that they see nothing to do around it. None of it makes any sense to them if you really try to ask them about it. If you said to them and really question them on, do you know that those votes are being counted correctly?
It's
Do you know
well,
that?
it's
Do you know that they're even being counted? They might just be getting burned.
even if every single vote is counted in a sacred, clean process, are you having a conversation if all that's happening is someone is asking you questions?
Mm.
That's that's what's there's no real direct feedback there. And there's some hand-wringing lip service when it comes to that, but really, it's all the exceptions. It's all the, well, how do we frame this? How do
Well,
we deal with
yeah.
this? What do we vote about?
One guy corners you in an alleyway and says, "I'm gonna mug you." He's a bad guy. But two guys corner you in an alleyway and the two of them ask you, which one of us do you want to mug you? Then they're good guys.
Yeah, what color would you like the gun to your head to be? Would you like a blue one or a red one? I'm participating in the political process. I'm a good citizen.
But no, it's that notion of the fact that, well, because they're both third parties in the engagement, as the mediating and neutral state as it is in the form of procedure, that then they are given the free right to engage in the exception because you've given them the political sort of legitimization. At least in the eyes of those that actually believe it all works.
Well, it again, it's whether you believe in the process or not. It's the big trick. It's you have to buy into all these assumptions to believe in the process anyway. And those who don't believe in the process just so happen to be the people who the exceptions apply to the most. They are the people who are, it fills a great function in that the exceptional group, the group that the norms aren't applied to, the group that you can justify the most against, are those who just so happen to not believe in your process. It's a very nice, like, circular logical system, in that
Well,
we,
obviously this comes back actually to a thing I think I mentioned a couple of times now, but it is one of those ways whereby you learn through tautologies. It
yes.
is that thing we looked at in the Vanity Fair article about Yarvin, where the guy in it is like, well, these people just take these things that are given aspects of politics and then you know they just talk about them over and over again. It's like, yes, it's because we're learning from the fact that someone must enact policy. That means that there is a real either individual or groups of individual must enact policy, and those people aren't just as you said, they aren't just neutral actors. They are human beings. It doesn't even necessarily have to be
Yeah.
an aspect of ideology or anything like that. It's just very plain and simple.
Yeah, these two. I've actually been rewatching the X Files a little bit recently, and there's a great, just some great little quotes in there. Where yeah, the global elite are in the business of appearing to predict the future, and the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Is to just make it up.
Well, that's
Is to
also
be the people who are in charge of it.
it's the Bond film,
Yeah.
Tomorrow Never Dies.
Yes.
And he goes and gets like people to bomb some airport somewhere, and then he switches on his weird like Rupert Murdoch network of news executive people. Was like, oh, there was a bombing there. No way! How could that have happened?
Hey, we've been preparing for these pandemics for years. Oh no, there's a pandemic. You have to do what we say. Okay. Oh no, another brown person blew up. You can't blame the brown people though. Uh, don't look back in anger, guys. Oh god, it was some anniversary of that recently, and that I don't know. As I try not to impotently rage at the news cycle. I try not to angrily bark at the headlines,
Hmm.
but it always sticks in my craw, that one, because as I've explained to people before, I used to commute through Manchester, Victoria, which the MEN Arena is attached to, and I'm a child of the four chins. I'm somebody who used to like regularly use live leak when it happened. I'm not a very easy person to bother with like graphic footage, but I used to walk past like this set of stairs every day and seeing like screaming children run down them as like blood literally runs down these stairs. It's a very difficult image to shake. Um, and that's again, it's the declaration of, you can't be angry about this. Don't look back in anger. This is our reaction. This is how we feel during this, during this unprecedented time. We can't give in to our violent. We can't blame the other, basically very, very heavily signaling that the immigrant is not your enemy, and that we must look to use these powers that we're creating in a different light. We must find our exception. We must find our energy within. We must differentiate our friend from our enemy. And this person who did the bad thing is still from the friend group. And that the nakedness of that, it makes me very angry. Oh God, the bee! Don't remind me of the bee. Oh. Oh, no. James Murray, that reminded me of yeah, there was a stupid symbol of like the reaction to that, which was like some fucking like MENB, be proud or something like that, and it was
Is that
it
where
was like a
that's
live
from? That's all to
yeah.
do with the bombing
No,
in the
it was
arena.
it was a symbol before that, I
Ah,
think, but
right.
they used it. They used it as that. They used it as a symbol of don't look back in anger, basically. Ugh. Sorry, I've been reminded of like heinous amounts of cringe.
Weaponized.
Weaponized cringe.
Uh,
But it's you see these cases all the time.
well, I was going to say actually, do you want to go into the little section you've got from Robert Higgs here?
Yes, yes, we're about nearly an hour in, so I think it's about time to get to that. Because this really is, it's like, oh, why would they do this?
Hmm.
How would you benefit from creating an endless crisis? It's
Uh,
it's
feel free to
it's a slightly
read this
it's
section if you
it's
want.
I will do, yes. I'm gonna let you scroll through. It's in the middle of the article,
Oh no, I've already got it
because
up. I've got the little heading.
it's a section where it says the political economy of fear. I'm actually going to put it in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Here you go. This is another article from I can say our good friends over at the Mies Institute, since I've had Phil Bishop on. Well, we can make that claim. We're cool. No, from
No,
from the good
I was
people
to
over.
say I've just noticed we'll be handing over to Radlib possibly this evening. They are streaming on the law. The fact the law is not neutral; it's politics by other means, and they're going off of Gottfried, of course, who studied from Schmitt. There's a nice little
That's
double bill
that's
for everyone this evening.
a nice little follow up. If I could work out how to do that whole raid thing, I would do. But what I'll do is at the end of the stream, I'll put his stream link in the chat, and
Hmm.
I'll make a community post about it. So
Cool.
we're going to try and do handovers and be a bit more of an organized community, because I think that's a nice thing to do. But that's kind of by the by. I'm gonna read the quote now. This is from the section marked political economy. Fear, like every other productive resource, is subject to the laws of production. Thus, it cannot escape the law of diminishing marginal productivity. As successive doses of fear-mongering are added to the government's production process, the incremental public clamor for governmental protection declines. The first time the government cries wolf, the public is frightened. The second time, less so. The third time, less so. Again, that's why we see these diminishing returns from the coronavirus narrative. If the government plays the fear card too much, it overloads the public's sensibilities, and eventually people discount almost entirely the government's attempts to frighten them further. Having been warned in the 1970s about catastrophic global cooling, then soon after was catastrophic global warming, the populace may grow wary of heeding the government's warnings about the dire consequences of alleged global climate change. Dire unless, of course, the government takes stringent measures to bludgeon the people into what must be done to avert the avert the predicted disaster. Some great use of language here. Fear is a depreciating asset. As Machiavelli observes, the temper of the multitude is fickle, and while it is easy to persuade them of a thing, it is hard to fix them in that persuasion. Here, Machiavelli talking about the current thing. Very, very neat there. But I thought this was very stringent. Sorry, I thought this was not. It's very stringent language. I thought this was very relevant because it is so. It's such a good explanation of why this is done, of why you have to have these escalating crises. Because like a morphine addict mainlining, eventually the effects are diminished, and you just have to take larger and larger doses of fear to buy into this narrative. That's why we've gone from things like,
Well,
the vague threats of the Cold War
yeah.
to
So
the very present.
I was going to continue reading a
So
little
go on.
bit here. He's got because it's actually quite interesting. The government must make up for the depreciation by investing in the maintenance, modernization, and replacement of its stock of fear capital. For example, during the Cold War, the general sense of fear of the Soviets tended to dissipate unless restored by periodic crisis. Many of
Yes,
which
I was
took
about to read that
many
bit.
of which took the form of officially announced or leaked gaps between US and Soviet military capabilities. Troop strength gap, bomber gap, missile gap, anti-missile gap,
The
first
missile
strike
gap.
missile gap, defense spending gap, thermonuclear throwaway war gap, and so forth.
Yes, the famous one was their complete deliberate misinterpretation of the I think it was the MiG-25 or the MiG-29, the one that was basically made of sheet steel, and they thought it could outmaneuver everything, and it really couldn't maneuver at all.
Hmm.
It would basically break its airframe because it was so heavy. But there was all this fear mongering around these secret Soviet aircraft. There's the technology, the secret Soviet technology, and they're struggling to like cobble together copies of 1960s computers in the 80s. And they're just very, very obviously on the verge of collapsing under their own weight, to the point that throughout the 1970s, there is a large amount of life support that happens for the Soviet Union from the West, technologically. Again, I can't remember the name of the book now, but there's some great stuff, partially from Anthony Sutton. Although this is getting a bit towards his cold fusion era, because he does go off the deep end of the 90s, unfortunately, Sutton. Where he talks about the falsehoods of the Cold War and the huge amount of very deliberate proxy trade, and especially the allowance of the Soviets to have the atom bomb, and the way that that's very almost deliberately allowed to happen, to create this situation of permanent stalemate. But yeah, he's right. The Cold War was a great one because really the button was never about to be pressed. There was a few episodes of brinkmanship. Everyone talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but after that, really they had extremely good communication between the two sides at an executive level, to prevent that kind of essentially misunderstanding from happening again. Because it did get a little bit hairy, but that's one of the only episodes. It's the idea in the 1980s that there was going to be thermonuclear war. If you look back on it now, if you look back on the realities, it's ridiculous. The Soviets were too busy dealing with their own internal problems. They were too busy dealing with their essentially rotting military infrastructure to think about projecting power. That's why the Afghan
Well,
war
he
happened
does.
how it did.
There is a nice little bit here where defence contractors, of course, have long devoted themselves to stoking fears of enemies, big and small, around the globe who allegedly seek to crush our way of life at the earliest opportunity. Boeing's often shown TV spots, for example, assure us that the company is contributing mightily to protecting our freedom. If you believe that, I have a shiny hunk of useless Cold War hardware to sell you. The news and entertainment media enthusiastically jump on the bandwagon of foreign menace alarmism, anything to get the public's attention. It even goes on to Say's Law. I think I've read this essay before, it's really good.
It is a good essay. It's very. I know we always get it up. It's an image we always get up. It's very Sun newspaper 45 minutes from attack.
Yeah.
Um,
45 minutes out
Saddam's
from
gonna.
nuclear strike.
Yeah, because what happened is the Blair administration, the Blair regime, got out a map and did some little fag packet maths. Like what Soviet theoretical Soviet missile could Saddam have, and what is its maximum range, and what is within range of that has British people in it. And the best thing they could come up with was he's going to gas Cyprus.
Yeah. There's actually
In which case,
some more interesting stuff here. He actually goes on a bit of. He almost ties himself to bloody Gottfried here, but he credits Thomas Saz for the therapeutic part, which I suppose is somewhat right. At every point,
yeah,
opportunists latch onto existing fears and strive to invent new ones to fear their own nests, or feather their own nests, sorry. Thus, public school teachers and administrators agree that the nation faces an education crisis. Police departments and temperance crusaders insist that the nation faces a generalized drug crisis, or at times a specific drug crisis, such as an epidemic of crack cocaine use. Public health interests foster fears of epidemics that in reality consist not of the spread of contagious pathogens, but the lack of the personal control and self responsibility, such as the epidemic of obesity or the epidemic of juvenile homicides. By means of this tactic, a host of personal peccadillos have been medicalized and consigned to the therapeutic state. I mean, what we're almost seeing here is some of your kind of the juvenile, high, middle, low, or the CA bond, central power, tributary and periphery, or secondary power and periphery, or whatever way the framing is for it. I can't quite remember at the moment, but
yeah.
the sort of the bottom rung public sector workers are used as the group to be elevated through the period of the exception of the education crisis at the expense of the pre-existing and obviously failing education institutions that would have probably been private or in some sense prior to legislated in a way that they had some element of sovereignty. That the teachers themselves in class would have been the people to decide that actually there's an education crisis going on here and I'm going to do something about it, as opposed to the government declaring an education crisis via think tanks and then teachers being like, please help us do something about it.
If you talk about education, the very famous case with the Blair education reforms is Blair's complete destruction of the vocational school system. What was left of it. He really did kill the old polytechnics, the trade schools, the places people went to pick up actual skills, and decided that these were creating people with these terrible dead end jobs, and they didn't have degrees, therefore they weren't upwardly mobile. So everyone has to go out and get a degree now. Oh no, why does nobody have any skills? And then the Cameron government comes in and does another therapeutic trick in which they essentially go about reversing that through their own means, but not really. You get these twin kind of switches in which the state creates a problem, the state solves a problem, and then it switches back and forth in this binary manner in which they create these problems and then pretend to solve them over and over again. And this is a cycle that's continued really since the beginning of public involvement in education.
I mean,
And really what would happen...
let's look at something more recent. And it's something we actually talked about but didn't frame it in this way, and I think maybe we could for the sake of interest. Mass shootings is an exceptional social phenomenon when mass gang shootings are run of the mill on America's streets every weekend, or every week, every weekday, probably.
Yes.
And yet, no reporting of that, but that Salvador, whatever his name is, goes and does this. And there was like 6 or 7 articles I saw on Apple News this morning that were like, he opened the door and said, "I am the devil. I am here." He opened the door and menacingly waved his arms around, his AR-15 around, and said, "Well, what have we got here?" This was literally the headlines they had. That's along with the other ones the other day about how they had to identify the children via DNA swabs because that's what an AR-15 does.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe in the 40 minutes the police didn't enter the building, something can be explained about. He had
Hmm.
plenty of time to say these supposed action and horror movie lines. But yeah, you're right. It reminds me as well. The previous cycle of this is in the 1920s when you got all the hysteria that led to the NFA,
Hmm.
with all the prohibition shootouts. And really, you end up with like a hardware race in which the feds were going in heavy and basically just fucking shooting everybody. And so you get these escalating wars. It's very much like the MRV stuff now,
Hmm. Well,
in which
this is something that connects to the Patriot Act because this little
yes,
one here actually it tells us about all sorts of little interesting things that the Patriot Act actually allows them to do. Ba, 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 ba. More surveillance is the first one, of course, because I mean, the Patriot Act was really one of the big bills that opened the door for. I mean, you don't get Facebook, then the Patriot Act. You get the Patriot Act, then
Act,
Facebook.
then you get Facebook. Yes,
And I'm
it's
gonna
what.
leave that to lie there as we continue on.
No, I will just elucidate that slightly further in that we know for a fact that the biggest customers of Google and Facebook and Amazon have been the deep state, the intelligence community, and the industrial military complex. It's very, very open about that. They were recently arguing about like a $1 trillion contract, something stupid like that, to basically remake the entire encrypted infrastructure of the U.S. defense system. But it allows the dragnet
Well, yeah,
surveillance that these.
here we go. This ties into two of the different things we have talked about already or have been brought up. Patriot Act allows investigators to use the tools that were already available to investigate organized crime. You're talking about the FBI and the CIA being set up for the legal exception of dealing with the mafia in the 20s and 30s, and
Yep.
drug trafficking. The DEA, the extensions to the ATF and CIA, you know, arms that they have all gained during, Reagan's war on drugs and Clinton's war on drugs, all these different exceptional circumstances where all these different drugs entities needed all this funding. And so that now the drugs entities, the organized crime entities have these resources. All we need now is a little bit of paper and an event or two to happen so that we can then argue that, not only can these things be used to deal with social ills like organized crime and drug trafficking, we can now deal with political ills. It actually at this point, almost in a certain way, becomes an expressly political use of these resources.
Well, it is an like explicitly political use of these
Mm.
resources. You you end up in a situation where, like you said, you have all these different. There's the war on drugs that you talked about. There's the forgotten war in the 90s that ended up with Ruby Ridge and Waco.
Uh,
The war on the militias.
Wait, I'm sorry, I'm
Um,
just reading. As Senator Joe Biden explained during the floor debate about the act, the FBI could get a wiretap to investigate the mafia, but they could not get one to investigate terrorists. To put it bluntly, that was crazy. What's good for the mob should be good for terrorists. Thank you, Sleepy Joe.
It's very much, again, that's like a very ham-fisted. It's just like, we put all this legislation in place during the Prohibition era, and we can't target the public effectively with it because things have changed a bit. It's kind of funny them using that. It's like, yeah, it's almost like wiretapping laws exist in the abstract, and if you think somebody's going to commit a serious crime, you can actually surveil them with existing legislation. The idea that the FBI couldn't put surveillance on
Oh God, bloody
suspected terrorists is
roving wiretaps, which is basically a government decree that you have no privacy.
oh yeah, the roving wiretap thing is what led to Prism. It's what led to the Dragnet collection of phone records that I talked about. It is, and like I said, it's directly what led to the business model of big data. No Patriot Act, no big data. In fact, I would also argue that GDPR in the EU is one of the things that codifies big data
Hmm.
because it essentially legalizes it
Yes, well, because
through
you've
legislating
agreed
it.
to it.
Yeah, it's like we're going to legislate the dragnet collection of your data. It's like, well, can they just not?
Here's also your admittance that all federal agencies are engaging in conspiratorial actions. The Patriot Act facilitated information sharing and cooperation among government agencies so they can better connect the dots. End quotes.
Mm,
The
mm.
government's prevention efforts should not be restricted by boxes on an organizational chart. Now, police officers, FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and intelligence officials can protect our communities by connecting the dots to uncover terrorist plots before they are completed. See, we never catch them in the act. It's always the interesting
No,
part to me. We get them before, we get them after. We never get them in the act.
no one's ever captured with like a bomb strapped to them. No.
Nah, that's really funny, that isn't it?
It's extremely bizarre. Uh, well, to link it back to the stuff we've been talking about, like you said, the war on terror, the Patriot Act, then the era of big data. It's exception building an exception.
Hmm.
It's America was attacked. They attacked the Pentagon guys, so therefore Patriot Act, therefore all this nightmare stuff.
Yep.
But after that, we have a problem now with all these people on the internet. Oh, and we just so happen to have a suite of powers that we want to enhance to deal with these people. Builds on the Patriot Act, builds on what's come before, and builds on the fact that really, even when the prison files came out, the U.S. public essentially just accepted them.
But
They just accepted that this is what happens.
people are saying in chat, oh well, this it's the so it's some obvious that war on drugs and war on terror was cooked up to give an enemy they could never defeat, meaning they need more and more powers to keep fighting the war. There is of course that, but there is also the angle here of maybe because they're not stupid, they've thought for the last 40 years, well, if we have these 4 or 5 crises, we can take all the resources from those, have a sixth crisis where we take all those resources and we use them on the populace. Because that's what
Yeah.
COVID was. I mean, they built up on on an even higher level than the way that the uh, Patriot Act, explicitly put those resources into politics. It was even on a deeper level, even though it didn't say it in the same way. The friend enemy distinction for COVID was so much wider and so much deeper, and the resources used against those who were on the enemy side of that was, unprecedented in the truest sense of the word, and that was built
It,
up from all the terror bills beforehand. Sorry, I'll let you go.
no, I guess it was. I'm agreeing with you there. We got to a point where the UK government were explicitly using boxcar rhetoric on people who had the goal to sit on a park bench outdoors.
Hmm.
That they were saying that people who don't follow the letter of these rules are quite literally murdering your fellow countrymen and need to be removed into camps. That's what they did in Australia. Like I feel like the crazy person with a mortarboard. It's like, no, they put people in camps from which they were hunted down like dogs if they escaped, like those poor fucking terrified Aboriginal children who essentially got forcibly relocated into a camp away from their families. Um, uh,
But this is
it's
as Higgs tried to tie in the therapeutic aspect, and as we have tied the sort of therapeutic outlook of the state is very similar to that of Ted Kay's outlook, whereby people who are in a certain sense the exception in regards to the procedure that we are supposed to follow, at some point those people can no longer be, they can't have their exceptional characteristics exercised out of them through whatever means of propaganda that are being used. I mean, one thing I briefly mentioned in the chat today on Telegram that I thought was kind of interesting. Someone sort of asked a question that made me realize something about something I'd already sort of put a mention down about. But the way that the media apparatus nowadays takes run-of-the-mill people who happen to, for one reason or another, touch on some progressive issue or confirm some progressive issue or go against it, and they take this person, they either elevate them or they denigrate them in a sort of struggle
Yes.
session kind of fashion. And what they do this is they do this in front of the public. So instead of the idea of Mao when he talks about molding people into the socialist ideal, that was done in small groups, and amongst those he wished to do it too. Whereas the media takes, people who may or may not be prospective elites, puts them through the mold either in a positive fashion by affirming the things that they have said that are progressive or have done that are progressive, or by denigrating them for being anti-progressive and telling them what they really should do. And that we're all watching this happen over and over again. I just think it then became very sort of an interesting way to look at it, as there's a sort of public struggle session that we're all watching as these people are lifted and dropped as is needed.
Yes, they are. They are struggle sessions. It's always disappointing when people engage with them like they're genuine too.
Mm,
You get the likes of the internet talking heads. You get all of these, the news cycle absorbers, the BuzzFeed article regurgitators. They all engage with this process like it's genuine.
mm.
They engage with it like, is this life or death? They become part of the braying crowd. They very much absorb themselves, earnestly into the dialectic, whether they realize it or not, and they engage with this process, and they don't realize that they are really, they are the people booing at the pantomime. This is supposed to be your reaction. It's supposed to become the news item for that week.
Mm.
And all of these think tanks, all of these NGOs, all of these policymakers and these PR people must know about that
Or
circle
some of them
and
must
how
at
they
least.
react. Yes,
And again,
they
it sort of comes back to the topic that we're talking about here, because if you can recognize that both the woke and the anti woke don't really offer you anything, they just put you into the, as we described, the sort of struggle session. They just involve you in it, and whatever, how, no matter how much you wish to involve yourself in it. And in the same sense that when people get into the debate about COVID policy or something like the Patriot Act, maybe the Patriot Act isn't the best example because we weren't engaging with stuff in the same way, but definitely with COVID, there was a lot of debate
yeah.
about the virus, about this policy, that policy. There
Well,
was no debate at all about, or there was very little debate, I should say, about whether or not it was even right for the government to declare the state of exception that they did.
no.
There was no discussion of that whatsoever, because that was ultimately the key thing that you would use to legit or delegitimize the government in that period.
Again, I like you said, you will never see an end to any of these kind of states of emergency. They trail off.
Mm,
They become background noise. But what do you hear on the train still every day? You've got used to it. It doesn't like I always consciously try and make a mental note of it because I do not want it to become background. But all those see something, say something
mm,
messages that you get on the train, that you are constantly reminded. It's just someone whispering and go, oh, by the way, someone could blow you up today.
yeah.
It's like it's an extremely remote chance. You have a much greater chance of being struck by lightning or winning the lottery. But yeah,
Big
someone could
Brother's
blow you up
still
today.
watching you. Don't
Yeah, yeah.
worry.
You should carry on with your journey safely, but do be afraid. Do remember that you could get blown up today. That's that guy who left his suitcase. He might have just not innocently left his suitcase. That man could be trying to blow you up, and you should call the security services, and you should go through this whole process and cause a massive public panic because someone forgot a suitcase. Because we don't want to, deport all the fucking Wahhabists that we know are here. We're just gonna make you terrified of abandoned luggage for the rest of your life.
Yep.
Oh, it's and that's what people got used to. There's posters everywhere still. There's because I took a picture of one and posted it of those ridiculous posters, like three of them, next to three COVID posters, and being like how are people still existing without being like schizo posting in the way that we sometimes do? Just like how do you not see this? How does this just become background noise to you? How could you? how can your reality be so distorted that you think this is normality and you think this is a sincere attempt by an entity to look out for your safety rather than just to scare you into submission?
Well,
How do you not see this as the most insincere and cynical attempt to create these infinite exceptions? As one exception bleeds into the other like a giant
like
Katamari ball of fear.
this is a David Dees painting from God knows when, but this is the world you actually live in. Like he, like in that way that you're saying, we are
Yeah,
actually used to the fact that like to some extent there is an element of like vaccine checkpoints and this weird therapeutic police
you
and like
you
mothers being like we have watched a replication of this image happen in media in front of us, and we all just sat there and did nothing about it.
it's like when we found the rewilding one.
Yeah,
Like every time we deep dive into a topic, I realize that David Dees is the Terry A. Davis of political cartoons. um, all hail the schizos, for they might actually be right. Poor David Dees. I hope Jess still has the correspondence she had with him.
hmm.
Because I don't know. I know she was public about some of it, but Jess, who some of you may know, some of you may follow on Twitter, she actually conversed with David Dees via email relatively frequently during his final days. And that was both interesting and harrowing, and I
Yeah,
was genuinely quite upset when the man died. Because it did part of some of the way that he was may have also been to do with physical illness. And that's quite poignant, really. And yet, it may or may not have been a result of some kind of brain cancer, but he was still able to see the things,
hmm.
even if it is, broken schizo clock occasionally. But he's been too right too often. And yeah, these are images that, whether genuine or not, we were fed. We were fed the people spraying the streets in China in their white and
Yeah,
basically like
we
a
got stuff that was actually worse than this in some ways. Because like
yes,
there's no masks, there's no like
yeah,
hazmat
hazmat.
suits. Oh God.
Um, I- a lot of people didn't like
Also, all the
in
police
London.
officers are white. You got that bit wrong.
I'm gonna say, yeah,
This
there's
this child should be brown. That woman should have a black eye. I'll stop.
oh dear. It's and the point that we witnessed this. We witnessed, propaganda that was meant to be deliberately worse than this. Like I said, the stuff we got from China with the vehicles spraying the streets with suds, the double
People
hazmat
being welded
suits,
into their apartment
people being
blocks.
welded into their homes, people collapsing in public.
With the folk
You
that
know,
turned black.
yeah,
The
yeah, yeah, yeah.
uh,
But like all the stuff about like necrosis and all this, which is completely false. It
don't
was
worry,
them just trying to hide.
that was the secret monkeypox footage that the White Helmets filmed in a Turkish airport in like 2014 that we aren't supposed to see yet.
The secret monkeypox footage. Oh dear.
That's late stage
Um,
psyop, and they fed us that one too early.
what other? Do
Mm.
we have any more sources to go over here then?
I mean, there is I think no, I think we've actually been through everything. Yeah, we've worked our way through them.
I've been quite concise today. Um, there's another little bit of theory I wanted to mention though.
Hmm.
Because I went into it a little bit before, but the like we didn't fully explain the declaration of the end of COVID, the declaration of peace,
Hmm.
the,
Yes.
the the declaration of the end of the pandemic, is an act of supreme
Well,
sovereign
yes,
power.
because to say when the exception starts is just as important to say when the exception finishes.
Yes. Um, and as we have noticed in unison, the quote unquote Western democracies.
White helmets are my favorite NWO flash mob.
Where's my TikTok videos of the white helmets dancing?
Yeah, like yeah, they're doing like the Fortnite dance actually in the middle of a war zone.
No, they're doing a Fortnite dance, actually holding like the rubber prosthetic, like the special effects film prop of a child that they use. Oh
Bana
dear.
Alabed's just like front and center.
Yeah, they've got like the absolutely what are they called? the Islamic like chant songs. It's like clashing of swords is one of them because
Yeah.
clashing of swords absolutely slaps. And
Dun,
I will
dun,
not
dun,
hear
dun.
I will not hear otherwise.
And
That is an absolute banger.
yeah, and it's Naria Al Saba is on the vocals, by the way.
Nasheeds, that's it. They're going ham. They got like a tick dance to a nasheed.
See, they
Thanks
might
for
only be bested
being me
by
there.
like whatever weird like Pakistani groups exist to that, and they'd like dance to like Tunak Tunak or something. Because that's a Tunak Tunak is up there with the Clashing of the Swords, to be honest.
Uh, but no, it's you must a lot of what I wanted to get across here, and a lot of what you want to get across here is that you have to think about politics almost from a completely outside perspective to
Mm.
understand some of this stuff. I know a lot of people have a lot of trouble with it, and that's because of how you've been, how we are educated about politics in general. We take the system for granted. Um, that's honestly where a lot of Marxist analysis, even though they lead people to completely the wrong conclusions, is superior to a lot of, quote
But yeah,
unquote
because
liberal
they're thinking
or
about
conservative
they're
analysis.
thinking about a state that just has to solve problems, not a state that
Yeah.
has to abide by a legal code. Which is that the
Yes.
idea of the sorry, very loud like Windows antivirus thing there. Apologies for that. And that's why they see the state as like the mediator of class conflict. It is not the generator of legal and legitimate law, because even the most brain dead of Marxists most of the time can recognize the state as a non-neutral actor, which is the point that we're getting at. I think here, for the state to
It
make
is.
the exception, it must be making the exception because it believes there is some validity in either doing so or being seen to be doing so.
That very much leads into, though, you're almost doing a handoff there.
Hmm.
We'll do a prop in a second. Is there anything you want to shill before we hand off to Radlib stream, which is currently live, but hasn't been live that long?
We should have a little interesting stream on Monday about A's book, and we'll be discussing some other stuff to do about the sort of the notion of chronicling in a right wing canon. So, because I know some people have
Yes.
enjoyed our streams where we talk about narrative, and I think that
Mhm.
if we're gonna go like a foundational level behind narrative and historiography, we need to think about having a body and a canon of writers. But more on that on
And
Monday.
yes, so James Murray makes a very good point here. In declaring what is the exception, you also declare what is the norm,
Yes.
and that is the power of the quote unquote neutral state. Because what is not neutrality is the exception. That is what
And
we're getting at.
that happens over time. The exception
Yes.
becomes neutral when the new exception makes the old exception neutral.
But yeah, where I'm hoping to finally have my speech out from back in March on Saturday. I've got an update from someone who's copy editing it, and they're going to get done tomorrow, so that should be out Saturday. We'll finally have something else up. I'm going to need to go and finish some of my other past finished arts because I've just not had time. I'm a
Uh,
very busy boy at work.
I think as well,
Um,
hopefully in the next couple weeks, we should have some stuff to tell people about the next Nomos event.
yes, we will do over the coming couple of weeks. I'm hoping to have an announcement out there.
So,
I'm just waiting to hear back from a couple of people who may have some friendly venues for the Friday thing. So
cool. Well, listen out for that, people.
yes, yes, do we are still doing the Nomos things, but to hand you off to very capable hands, I'll give people a few minutes there. I've linked it in the chat. Do go and raid Radlib Radical Liberation because he's doing a stream which very much follows on from
Yes.
this.
Tell them,
They use
tell them we sent you, and they're gonna tell us the process by which the infinite exception can be drawn up.
Yes, do go do a scrump raid. We're going raiding Radlib, so I've put that in the chat there. I'll put a little community post out as well. Thank you guys for watching, and good night.
Good night. I'm gonna open.